The Battle of the Little Bighorn, often referred to as Custer's Last Stand and known among the Lakota and other Plains tribes as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, unfolded on June 25, 1876, near the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. This significant confrontation was fought between the combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, and the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The battle marked a pivotal moment in the Great Sioux War of 1876, resulting in a resounding victory for the Native American forces against the U.S. military. To understand the battle, it is essential to consider the events leading up to it. The Great Plains had become the last stronghold for Native Americans in the United States, as settlers pushed westward in search of new opportunities. Following the Civil War, the influx of settlers intensified, as people sought to capitalize on the promise of land and resources in the West. However, the arid conditions of the Great Plains made it a challenging environment for agriculture, and few settlers had managed to establish permanent roots there. The vastness of the plains and the presence of large indigenous populations created a complex and often contentious relationship between Native Americans and incoming settlers. Tensions escalated further with the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1874, an area sacred to the Lakota. The U.S. government, in violation of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, sought to annex the Black Hills, prompting outrage among the Lakota. In response, the U.S. military launched a campaign to force the tribes onto reservations. As a result, many Native Americans, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, rallied their forces to resist the encroachment of settlers in the military. Leading up to the battle, the U.S. Army sought to suppress the growing resistance among Native tribes. General Philip Sheridan, tasked with controlling the situation, initiated a three-pronged military campaign to capture the Lakota and their allies. Custer's 7th Cavalry was one of the units deployed, and he was given the mission to engage the Native forces and force them onto reservations. However, Custer, known for his brashness and a tendency to act impulsively, underestimated the strength and resolve of the Native American warriors. On the day of the battle, Custer split his forces into 3 battalions, a decision that would prove disastrous. While he moved forward with his battalion, he encountered a large encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors along the Little Bighorn River. Believing he could achieve a quick victory, Custer ordered his men to attack without waiting for reinforcements from Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, who were engaged in their own skirmishes nearby. The Native American forces, led by courageous leaders such as Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, were well prepared and motivated to defend their territory. As Custer and his men charged into the camp, they were met with fierce resistance. The combined Native forces, numbering in the thousands, quickly encircled Custer's battalion. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the cavalrymen found themselves in a precarious position. The battle raged on as the Native warriors displayed exceptional bravery and tactical prowess. Custer's troops, equipped with outdated weapons, struggled against the overwhelming numbers of their adversaries. Within hours, Custer and nearly all of his men were killed in a stunning defeat for the U.S. Army. The aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn resonated throughout the nation. News of the defeat shocked the American public, leading to widespread calls for revenge against Native Americans. The battle, while a significant victory for the Lakota and their allies, ultimately accelerated U.S. military campaigns against the tribes. The Great Sioux War continued, but the tide began to turn as the U.S. government mobilized more forces to subdue the Native populations. In conclusion, the Battle of the Little Bighorn stands as a crucial moment in American history, encapsulating the fierce struggle between Native Americans and the U.S. government during a time of rapid westward expansion. It serves as a reminder of the resilience of the indigenous peoples and their enduring connection to the land, while also highlighting the complexities and tragedies of American expansionism in the 19th century. After the Civil War, the demand for land in the far west intensified, leading to a scarcity of available territory. The U.S. government, eager to expand its influence and facilitate settlement, set its sights on the vast plains. This ambition was realized through the construction of railroads and the promotion of attractive land deals for settlers, which created an environment ripe for conflict. By the late 1860s, the majority of Native Americans had been forcibly relocated to so-called Indian reservations, or faced extermination. Determined to resist this grim fate, the Plains tribes prepared for a prolonged and fierce struggle to defend their way of life. In an effort to undermine the livelihoods of these native peoples, the government not only authorized the hunting of buffalo to clear land for railroad tracks, but actively encouraged hunters to decimate the buffalo herds. This ruthless campaign aimed to cripple the Plains tribes who relied on the buffalo for sustenance, clothing, and cultural practices. As hunters engaged in the indiscriminate slaughter of buffalo, tensions escalated dramatically. The destruction of the herds fueled deep resentment among Native Americans, leading some groups to retaliate with brutal attacks on hunters, settlers, and railroad workers, showing no mercy for age or gender. The cycle of violence and desperation grew as the tribes sought to defend their existence and way of life in the face of relentless encroachment. Earlier, during the Civil War, George Armstrong Custer had fought on the Union side, gaining a reputation as a bold and aggressive leader. By 1866, he found himself in a very different theater of war, the Great Plains, where he would soon face the fierce resistance of the Native American tribes. At this point, the conflict between the U.S. Army and the Plains tribes was already well established, marked by escalating hostilities as settlers encroached on native lands. Custer quickly realized that the war against the Plains natives was unlike any he had previously experienced. While he had engaged Confederate troops in the Civil War, battling indigenous forces presented a unique set of challenges. The native warriors were skilled horsemen, adept at navigating the challenging terrain of the Great Plains, and they employed tactics that emphasized speed and mobility. Custer soon learned that he would need to adapt his strategies to effectively confront an enemy that was both resourceful and resolute. In 1868, a significant development occurred when the U.S. government signed a treaty that recognized the Black Hills of South Dakota as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. This treaty was intended to establish peace and secure the rights of the Sioux Nation over their ancestral lands. However, this uneasy peace would be short-lived. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills during an Army expedition led by Custer in 1874 set off a chain reaction that would have dire consequences for the Sioux people. The expedition, intended to scout the region, inadvertently sparked a gold rush as news of the discovery spread like wildfire. Prospectors and settlers flooded into the Black Hills, violating the treaty and disregarding the rights of the Sioux Nation. In an attempt to remedy the situation, the U.S. government sought to negotiate the purchase of the Black Hills, but the Sioux, who considered the land sacred and central to their identity, vehemently refused to sell. The refusal to cede their sacred territory further fueled tensions between the native tribes and the U.S. government. The Sioux viewed the encroachment of settlers and the Army as an existential threat, leading them to prepare for conflict. Custer's earlier successes against the Cheyenne gave him a false sense of confidence in the face of the imminent showdown. However, he was about to enter a complex and devastating conflict that would forever alter the course of history. As the influx of settlers continued, the Sioux and their allies grew increasingly frustrated and desperate. Their traditional way of life, centered on the buffalo and the land, was under siege. The U.S. Army's efforts to assert control over the region culminated in the Great Sioux War of 1876, a brutal conflict that would ultimately lead to the infamous Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. Custer's leadership and military strategies would be put to the test in this escalating conflict. The dynamics of warfare had shifted. He would face a coalition of tribes who were not only defending their land, but were also unified in their resistance against an increasingly aggressive and expansionist U.S. government. The outcome of this battle would not only seal Custer's legacy, but would also mark a pivotal moment in the struggle between Native Americans and the United States. A fight over land, identity, and survival that would echo through history. Just 1 year earlier, in 1873, George Armstrong Custer found himself embroiled in a violent confrontation with a group of attacking Lakota Sioux during a survey for the Northern Pacific Railroad in the Yellowstone area. This skirmish marked Custer's initial encounter with some of the most significant figures of the Plains tribes, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. It was a harbinger of the tumultuous battles that lay ahead, foreshadowing the profound struggles that would define the Great Sioux War. By 1876, Custer's mission had escalated significantly. He was given the task of relocating all Native Americans in the area to designated reservations by January 31, 1876. This directive was part of a broader governmental strategy to control the native populations and secure lands for white settlers. The stakes were high. Any Native individual who did not comply with the order would be labeled as hostile, opening the door to military action against them. However, the Plains tribes, fiercely committed to their way of life and resistant to the U.S. government's encroachments, were not inclined to simply acquiesce. In the face of impending government pressure, many natives chose to leave their reservations. They traveled to Montana to unite with their fellow warriors and leaders, specifically the influential figures of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. These leaders had established a fast-growing encampment along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. The coalition of tribes that assembled there was immense, numbering in the thousands, and it was a sight that left many observers in awe. According to the Oglala Sioux warrior known as He-Dog, this gathering of native peoples was unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. The sheer size of the encampment was a powerful testament to the determination of the tribes to resist the U.S. government's efforts to force them into submission. As the spring months of March and April unfolded, the camp continued to swell with warriors and their families, bolstering their collective resolve. This massive gathering was not merely a display of numbers. It symbolized a united front among tribes that had often faced division and internal conflict. The Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes came together, driven by a shared desire to protect their lands, culture, and way of life from the relentless onslaught of settler expansion and military intervention. The sense of solidarity and purpose within this encampment galvanized the native leaders and warriors. They understood the significance of their stand against Custer and the U.S. Army. For Sitting Bull, a revered spiritual leader and visionary, this gathering represented not only a military alliance, but also a spiritual awakening, as he called upon his people to defend their sacred lands against what they perceived as an existential threat. Crazy Horse, known for his exceptional bravery and tactical prowess, emerged as a prominent military leader, rallying the warriors to prepare for the battles that were sure to come. As Custer and his forces prepared for their expedition into this volatile region, they were unaware of the magnitude of the opposition they would soon face. The combined forces of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, united at the Little Bighorn River, were not merely a ragtag group of warriors. They were a formidable army, ready to confront the encroachment of the U.S. government and defend their way of life. The stage was set for an inevitable clash, a confrontation that would go down in history as one of the most significant battles of the Indian Wars. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, which unfolded on June 25, 1876, would not only mark a pivotal moment in the Great Sioux War, but would also become emblematic of the broader struggle between Native Americans and the United States. This conflict was rooted in issues of sovereignty, identity, and the relentless drive for expansion that characterized American manifest destiny. As the two sides prepared to face off, the outcomes of their actions would reverberate through history, shaping the narratives of both the native peoples and the U.S. government for generations to come. As news of the impending confrontation with U.S. soldiers spread, native tribes began to converge near the Little Bighorn River. Reports from natives arriving from distant reservations along the Missouri River indicated that soldiers were mobilizing for a fight, prompting various tribes to gather in close proximity for mutual support and strength. This gathering was not just a casual assembly, it was a strategic alliance forged in anticipation of the military threat they faced. The encampment featured at least 6 or 7 closely situated camps, each representing different tribes. The Cheyenne formed the northernmost encampment, while the Sioux occupied the southern end. Among the Sioux, the Hunkpapas positioned themselves furthest south. These camps were not isolated, they were interconnected along the winding bends and loops of the river, with the Sonar, Miniconjou, Santee, and Oglala tribes all joining forces. Together with 5 Arapaho warriors, they represented a formidable coalition. Estimates suggest that the total number of people gathered was around 6,000 to 7,000, with approximately a third of them being men and boys of fighting age, who were prepared to take up arms. The warriors were well equipped for the impending battle, armed with a range of weaponry that included Winchester, Henry, and Spencer repeating rifles. These advanced firearms gave them a significant advantage over the single-shot rifles used by many U.S. soldiers at the time. Additionally, traditional weapons such as bows, arrows, and tomahawks were also part of their arsenal, showcasing a blend of modern and traditional warfare tactics. Before the battle commenced, a significant spiritual ritual took place, known as the Sun Dance, led by the renowned leader Sitting Bull. The Sun Dance was an ancient Native American ritual reserved for men, embodying deep cultural significance and spiritual renewal. This sacred ceremony aimed to invoke strength and guidance from the spirits, allowing the warriors to seek courage and fortitude in the face of the challenges ahead. The ritual typically involved fasting, dancing, and in some instances, the piercing of the skin as a form of sacrifice to the spirits. This intense and often painful act symbolized the warriors' commitment to their people and the land they sought to defend. The Sun Dance served as a profound reminder of their connection to their ancestors and the natural world, reinforcing their resolve to protect their way of life against the encroaching threat of the U.S. military. As the Sun Dance unfolded, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of anticipation and solemnity. Warriors danced in a trance-like state, embodying the spirits of their forebears, while the sounds of drums and chants echoed across the camp. This ceremony not only served to empower the men, but also unified the tribes in their collective cause. The act of gathering for the Sun Dance forged deeper bonds among the participants, reinforcing their determination to fight as one cohesive force. The presence of Sitting Bull, a highly respected spiritual leader and chief, added weight to the proceedings. He was a symbol of resistance and resilience, embodying the spirit of the Sioux Nation. His leadership during the Sun Dance instilled a sense of hope and purpose among the tribes gathered at the Little Bighorn. They were not merely fighting for their lands, they were also defending their identity, culture, and the very essence of their existence. As the final preparations were made and the rituals concluded, the warriors emerged from the sun dance with renewed vigor. They were ready to confront the soldiers who sought to displace them from their lands. This gathering of tribes represented a unique moment in history. An unprecedented coalition formed not just to fight against the U.S. Army, but to stand in defense of their heritage and way of life. The outcome of the Battle of the Little Bighorn would not only impact the immediate participants, but would resonate throughout Native American history, symbolizing a fierce resistance against oppression and a testament to the strength of unity among diverse tribes. The sacrifices made during this time would leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of Native peoples, serving as a powerful reminder of their enduring struggle for survival and sovereignty. The sun dance, a sacred ritual of the Lakota people, was performed by Sitting Bull, a revered medicine man and spiritual leader known for his deep connection to the spiritual world. In preparation for this significant event, Sitting Bull painted himself yellow to symbolize the sun, representing life, energy, and spiritual illumination. This act was not just about personal devotion, it was a collective call for spiritual guidance and clarity in the face of the impending conflict with U.S. forces. As the ritual commenced, Sitting Bull engaged in a profound act of self-sacrifice, removing pieces of flesh from his arms until they were stained with blood. This intense demonstration of devotion was rooted in the belief that pain could bring about a deeper connection to the spirit world. Following his lead, other men from the tribe joined him in the dance, embodying the shared commitment of the Lakota and their allies to defend their land and way of life. The dance lasted for 2 grueling days, fueled by the warriors' determination and the spiritual fervor ignited by Sitting Bull's leadership. The culmination of the sun dance came when Sitting Bull experienced a powerful vision. In this vision, he foresaw the imminent victory of the native forces in the battle to come. However, along with the promise of triumph, came a stern warning. No one was to take anything from the fallen soldiers, for such an act would bring great misery upon the Lakota people. This aspect of the vision was taken very seriously, as Sitting Bull had a history of prophetic dreams and visions that had proven to be accurate in the past. His previous predictions had bolstered the morale of the tribe, instilling a sense of hope and confidence that they could stand against the might of the U.S. Army. As the warriors emerged from the sun dance, they felt invigorated and united, carrying with them the weight of Sitting Bull's vision. Their spirits lifted, they prepared for the confrontation that loomed on the horizon. In contrast, the U.S. Army was also making its preparations, determined to round up the native tribes and force them back to their designated reservations. The Army dispatched 3 columns of soldiers to the Little Bighorn area, including Custer and his 7th Cavalry. Custer, known for his brash demeanor and aggressive tactics, led his men with the intent of subduing the native resistance. He believed that a swift and decisive action would not only bring victory, but also secure his reputation as a military leader. However, Custer was operating under the assumption that the native forces would be scattered and disorganized, unaware of the true scale and unity of the tribes gathered against him. As the day of the battle approached, tensions escalated. The combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes had formed a formidable alliance, preparing for a confrontation that would soon become legendary. The native warriors were well armed, equipped with repeating rifles and traditional weaponry, and their strategic advantage lay in their intimate knowledge of the terrain. When the battle began on June 25, 1876, the U.S. Army faced a united and resolute force. Custer's underestimation of the native resistance proved to be a grave mistake. The battle unfolded with ferocity as the warriors launched their coordinated attacks, utilizing the landscape to their advantage. In the midst of chaos, Sitting Bull's vision became a beacon of hope for the warriors. They fought with the strength of their ancestors behind them, their spirits high, as they recalled the warnings of Sitting Bull. The instructions to refrain from taking anything from the fallen soldiers resonated deeply within the warriors, reinforcing their sense of honor and purpose. As the battle raged on, the tide quickly turned against Custer and his men. The coordinated efforts of the native forces, driven by a shared sense of identity and cultural pride, overwhelmed the U.S. Army. The sounds of gunfire, war cries, and the thunder of galloping horses filled the air, creating a cacophony that would echo through history. The defeat of Custer and the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn was not merely a military victory. It was a pivotal moment in Native American history. It symbolized a powerful stand against the oppressive forces that sought to eradicate their way of life. The victory bolstered Native morale and unity, reinforcing the belief that they could resist the encroachment on their lands and culture. In the aftermath, the battle would be remembered not only for its dramatic confrontation, but also for the profound spiritual significance it held for the Lakota and their allies. Sitting Bull's prophetic vision and the sun dance became enduring symbols of resistance, echoing through generations as a testament to the resilience and determination of indigenous peoples in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of the Battle of the Little Bighorn continues to resonate today, serving as a reminder of the complexities of American history and the struggles for justice and recognition that persist in indigenous communities. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were armed with Springfield single-shot carbine rifles and Colt .45 revolvers, standard equipment for cavalry units of that era. These weapons, while effective at the time, would soon be put to the test against a determined Native American coalition. In mid-June 1876, General Alfred Terry, Colonel John Gibbon, and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer convened to strategize their military campaign against the native tribes in the area. Intelligence from a scouting party composed of Crow and Arikara scouts who were serving in the U.S. Army had led them to a native trail heading toward the Little Bighorn Valley. This information proved crucial, as it provided the U.S. Army with a clearer understanding of the movements of the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes. The meeting culminated in a pivotal decision. Custer would lead an advance on the native encampment, surrounding the tribes and awaiting reinforcements from Terry and Gibbon's forces. However, the plan soon began to unravel. Custer, driven by his aggressive military instincts and ambition for glory, chose to deviate from the initial strategy. Instead of adhering to the agreed-upon plan and waiting for backup, he resolved to launch a surprise attack against Sitting Bull's camp the very next day. On the morning of June 25th, Custer and his scouts located the sprawling encampment of Sitting Bull. The camp was a vibrant scene, bustling with the activities of several native tribes, including the Hunkpapa Sioux and Northern Cheyenne, who had gathered there in significant numbers. Rather than consolidating his forces and ensuring they were prepared for a coordinated assault, Custer decided to advance quickly toward the encampment. On their way, they engaged in sporadic gunfire with some native warriors, a tactic that would foreshadow the chaos that was to ensue. Custer's bold and somewhat reckless decision to split his forces into 4 distinct groups was a critical turning point in the unfolding battle. He divided his command of over 600 men into smaller contingents, believing that this would allow for a more strategic approach to encircling the encampment. However, this division significantly weakened their overall strength and made each group more vulnerable to the overwhelming numbers of native warriors they would soon face. The 4 groups included Custer's own command, which he led toward the center of the encampment, and detachments commanded by Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen. Reno was tasked with launching a frontal assault against the village, while Benteen was instructed to move to Custer's support. Custer believed that by attacking the camp from multiple angles, he would catch the native forces off guard and quickly overpower them. As the soldiers advanced, they were met with a sense of foreboding. The native warriors, well armed with repeating rifles and experienced in guerrilla tactics, were prepared to defend their homeland. The Lakota and Cheyenne had gathered not just as individual tribes, but as a unified front, ready to protect their way of life against the encroachment of U.S. forces. Custer's advance was initially met with some success, as they surprised the outer elements of the camp. However, as they pressed deeper into the encampment, they encountered fierce resistance. The native forces, alerted by the sounds of gunfire and the rapid approach of Custer's men, quickly rallied and organized a counteroffensive. The once dominant force of the 7th Cavalry found itself in a dire situation. The split in their ranks left them vulnerable to the combined strength of thousands of native warriors. What Custer had hoped would be a swift and decisive victory quickly spiraled into chaos as the realization dawned upon him and his men that they were facing a coordinated and determined enemy. In the ensuing conflict, the battlefield became a tumultuous scene of violence, dust, and confusion. Custer's earlier decisions, driven by a mix of ambition and urgency, ultimately led to catastrophic consequences. The battle that unfolded was not merely a military engagement. It became a testament to the resilience and strategic prowess of the native tribes, who fought fiercely to protect their lands and lives. As the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that Custer's gamble had failed. The tactical errors made by Custer in his eagerness to achieve glory would cost him dearly, as the tide of battle turned against his forces. The bravery and unity displayed by the native warriors at the Battle of the Little Bighorn would go on to secure their place in history, marking a significant moment of resistance against U.S. military expansion. The repercussions of this engagement would reverberate through the annals of American history, highlighting the complexities of the conflict between indigenous peoples and the United States government. Custer ordered one small battalion to remain with the supply train, while directing the other two, under Captain Frederick Benteen and Major Marcus Reno, to mount an attack from the south, aiming to prevent the native forces from escaping. He tasked Benteen with scouting to the southwest, ensuring no other native groups could launch a counterattack from their rear. Meanwhile, Reno was instructed to advance westward and assault the southern flank of the encampment. Custer led the final group, comprising 210 men, who planned to strike from the north. As the battle commenced, Reno's contingent moved first, engaging from the south. The native warriors, initially caught off guard, quickly rallied. They grabbed their weapons, organized themselves, and began firing back at the advancing troops. Reno's group, consisting of around 100 men, found themselves skirmishing with the natives, who were determined to defend their territory. Notable warriors such as He-Dog and Braveheart rode out to flank the soldiers, circling around a small hill positioned behind them. At that critical moment, Crazy Horse burst onto the scene with reinforcements, significantly bolstering the morale of the native forces and turning the tide of the encounter. The fierce resolve of the native warriors began to counteract the initial surprise of the U.S. cavalry, setting the stage for a brutal and chaotic confrontation. Reno's soldiers, now caught in a crossfire from two sides, quickly realized they were hopelessly outnumbered and made a hasty retreat, with native warriors pursuing them uphill. By the time they regrouped atop what would later be called Reno Hill, they had suffered significant losses, with at least 30 men dead on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Custer pressed northward at a gallop. As he advanced, he spotted a Cheyenne camp, primarily populated by women and children. Recognizing the vulnerability of his forces and the urgency of the situation, he made a strategic decision to divide his troops. He sent 2 companies west toward the river, in an effort to alleviate some of the pressure that Reno was facing, while he and his remaining 3 companies continued their push northward, searching for a suitable location to cross the river. On the southern flank, Benteen's troops, alerted by the sounds of gunfire, quickly moved to aid Reno. The combined forces of Reno and Benteen united, bolstering their defensive position against the oncoming assault. As this consolidation occurred, Crazy Horse and his warriors, realizing the threat posed by Custer's advance, began to pivot back toward the center of the expansive native camp. Their swift return was fueled by the fear of a second attack on the camp from the north, heightening the stakes of the already chaotic battle unfolding on the Little Bighorn. The native warriors, having spotted soldiers moving on the opposite bank, began to mobilize with increasing urgency. A group of Lakota Sioux, led by White Thunder, ventured eastward, soon joined by many other tribal members, eager to confront the U.S. forces. From their position in the tall grass, they opened fire on the soldiers, their numbers swelling as more natives surged from the south toward the riverbank. This overwhelming tide of warriors quickly bore down on the 2 companies that had been stationed there, forcing the soldiers to retreat to higher ground in a desperate bid for safety. Meanwhile, Crazy Horse, recognizing the shifting dynamics of the battlefield, pressed his forces further north. In a strategic assessment, White Thunder remarked that Custer had effectively been surrounded even before the fighting truly commenced. As the conflict escalated, Custer ordered his men to maintain their defensive positions, all the while scanning the terrain for a suitable location to cross the river. The natives launched a coordinated attack on the first line of soldiers, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. The initial formation shattered under the pressure, and as chaos erupted, the natives continued their assault, driving the remaining soldiers into disarray. The second defensive line soon found itself under intense attack as well, with the relentless onslaught leaving the soldiers increasingly vulnerable. Custer's attempts to regroup and find an effective means of crossing the river were further complicated by the ferocity and unity of the native forces, who were now fully engaged in a fight for their land and way of life. Custer, recognizing the dire situation, retreated to higher ground and attempted to reposition his forces. He ordered his soldiers to intercept the advancing natives, who were now pressing from a different direction. Despite fierce fighting, the second line of defense sustained heavy losses and was forced to retreat to the reserve line. Meanwhile, Crazy Horse orchestrated a brilliant tactical maneuver, successfully encircling the soldiers. As the native warriors initiated their assault from one side, Crazy Horse himself charged into the ranks of the soldiers, effectively trapping them from all angles. The overwhelming numbers of the native forces led to chaos among Custer's men. Many were killed in the fray, while others desperately retreated toward Custer's position, pursued relentlessly by the warriors. In a state of panic, Custer's men dismounted from their horses, using them as makeshift cover in a desperate attempt to shield themselves from the onslaught. However, the situation had devolved into a grim reality for Custer and his battalion. Surrounded on all sides, Custer's last stand was far from the noble fight he might have envisioned. Instead, it turned into a brutal slaughter. The native forces launched another wave of attacks, and in the chaos, Custer was killed, alongside every man in his battalion. He sustained 2 bullet wounds, one near his heart and another to his head. The battle, which had begun with strategic plans and ambitions, concluded in tragedy, marking a pivotal moment in the Great Sioux War and leaving an indelible mark on American history. Some of Reno's officers, having ridden out with their men toward the sounds of gunfire, observed a distant hill swarming with natives who appeared to be engaged in gruesome work, finishing off the wounded soldiers on the ground. This was a stark violation of Sitting Bull's earlier warning not to take anything from the fallen, signaling a troubling turn in the battle's aftermath. Meanwhile, the officers stationed at Weir Point noted a significant movement of natives, unlike anything they had ever witnessed before, advancing toward their position. In response to the growing threat, Reno's and Bentine's soldiers quickly formed a defensive line, encircling themselves as they prepared for the impending confrontation. The exchange of gunfire erupted once again, and the battle raged on throughout the day. Despite the ferocity of the conflict, General Terry's reinforcements finally arrived, shifting the dynamics of the battlefield. Now, it was the natives who found themselves outnumbered, compelled to pack up their camps and retreat. This marked the conclusion of one of the most significant defeats of the U.S. Army during the Plains Wars, leaving a lasting impact on the collective memory of both sides involved. In the end, the Battle of the Little Bighorn not only underscored the fierce resistance of the native tribes against encroachment, but also highlighted the complexities and tragic costs of warfare on the American frontier. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the content, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could share the video and support our channel on Patreon. We've also just launched some exciting merchandise, so be sure to check it out. Links are available in the description. Your support means the world to us.